not the gravestone of Brandon Lee, as most of you, of course, know. But did you know that there is another raven, much more before Brandon Lee murder, who doesn't rest in peace at all? Did you know that Edgar Allan Poe wrote the poem The Raven, and that the same Edgar Allan Poe was brutally murdered, and his murder was silenced and covered for almost 2 centuries. This was the first gravestone of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe inspired generation, and nowadays would be a man called a dark romantic writer, a dark gothic romantic writer. And when I will show you videos, did you know that Edgar Allan Poe was very handsome and he had very light blue eyes? Nobody told you that, maybe, but in a few I will show you Edgar Allan Poe in colors, and you will see. Look, he would be a contemporary dark, of course. He was a dark. It looks like watching the cover of the movie The Crow 1994 with Brandon Lee, who died murdered too. The Raven. Hi, followers, friends, viewers. Before unveiling the identity of the killer, and I swear name and surname of the murderer of Edgar Allan Poe, and then I will also show you extremely rare videos, photos, documents, and they are very shocking. I must tell you which were the investigation leads. Then, so I can take you straight to the solution of the murder of Edgar Allan Poe after almost 2 centuries. I start. The investigative leads. The first one, Edgar Allan Poe was victim of an assault where he was beaten to death. This is one of the first theories hypothesized by Elizabeth Hawkes Smith in 1867. According to this hypothesis, Edgar Allan Poe was taken by a crook because there was a crown who stated to have been harassed by Allan Poe. So this crook beated so strong Edgar Allan Poe, and so he brutally beated him to death. Second theory, Allan Poe was robbed and beaten to death. In this case, Eugene Dider wrote in 1872 that meanwhile he was in Baltimore, Allan Poe was invited to drink alcohol by some friends, and he stated that Edgar Allan Poe was an alcoholic, so he accepted the invitation and he got drunk. Then he started to wander alone at night in the city city of Baltimore until the point some criminals robbed him and beaten him brutally to almost death, leaving him dying in a blood pool. The third theory was very close to the solution of the case, but not properly in these circumstances. I can tell you that it was immediately the lead to take. So, at that time, there was in vogue the couping. That was a kind of election fraud where criminal gangs wanted the falsification of the election results in their favor. So they kidnapped people, above all poor people, homeless people, and they forced them to vote more times for the same candidate, giving them fake identity documents. And after having done this, on a side there were some poor people forced to drink and forced to this falsification with fake identity documents. But on the other side, other poor people was said, you will receive a prize. You can drink all the alcohol you want for free if you do this. And so they say Edgar Allan Poe could have been enticed because he was an alcoholic, then he was completely drunk and alone, then he wandered, then he could have lost his senses, and then he fell down on the ground, on which then he was found. Then another lead, alcohol. In almost 2 centuries they told you that this was the real cause of the death of Edgar Allan Poe, and they lied to you, hiding you shocking truths unspoken for almost 2 centuries. They told you that he died from delirium tremens due to alcoholism. However, when Edgar Allan Poe went to the doctor some months before, the doctor told him to detoxify completely, because if he would have started to drink alcohol again, it could be very, very dangerous. So Allan Poe entered in the Sons of Temperance to detoxify completely from alcohol, and every now and then he also used opium. And he did this because he was going to marry his long-time love, Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, and so he wanted to be completely sober. And some people of the time told you that then he gave up and started to drink heavily again. So now we have the solution. It's not the truth, because think about, I didn't know this shocking news. Incredibly, recently, and I'm talking about 1999, only many years ago. Now we are on July 2024. And you must know that when Edgar Allan Poe died, his hair were removed. So some scientists did exams on the true hair samples of Edgar Allan Poe. They analyzed his true hair in 1999. And the results showed that they had low levels of lead, not compatible with an alcoholic, and it also, these results reveal you that he was sober until the end of his life. He kept his promise to detoxify completely. Or, if we want to be more specific, he wasn't a man who drank bottle by bottle. He wasn't so alcoholic even in the past, because then they tarnished his reputation. But of course not in the last months. And think about that Edgar Allan Poe was murdered 10 days before his wedding. How? Such a great disgrace, because in all his life he has been so very, very unlucky. And I hope that only in death, now that many people and also me, I'm going to reveal you the hidden truths, his soul can rest in peace. So, another hypothesis, poisoning. The exams, the analysis on the true Edgar Allan Poe's hair sample show you that there were high levels of mercury just before his death. You must know that a doctor in 1849 prescribed Edgar Allan Poe the calomel, that is chloride of mercury. The poisoning from mercury provocates hallucinations, deliriums, a deep state of confusion, as Allan Poe was just a few days before dying. And however, the most recent exams show that the level of mercury was low. So it's completely to rule out the hypothesis of poisoning from mercury. To rule out, I can tell you, to rule out the poisoning from every substance. Another hypothesis that Edgar Allan Poe got the virus of the rabies, because at the end of the 90s, the cardiologist Benitez published an article on Maryland's Medical Journal stating that without the proof of DNA, is impossible to say that Allan Poe got the virus of rabies. So, even if, according to him, he had many symptoms of the rabies, there can't be a secure proof without the proof of DNA. And And after that the article was published, Jeff Jerome, who takes care of Poe House Museum of Baltimore, agreed with Benitez. Another theory, brain cancer. You must know that, and I didn't know it, the corpse of Edgar Allan Poe was exhumed almost after 30 years from his death, and a worker noticed a solid mass in his skull. At that time, the news was spread in all the newspapers, magazines of that time. While but the scientists rule out this theory because they say that the brain is one of the first parts of the body that decomposes after death. While the writer Matthew Pearl, after having consulted the forensic pathologist, claimed that solid mass in the skull could have been a brain cancer that calcified after his death. I can tell you that this is not the cause of the death of Edgar Allan Poe. And I agree with the scientists who say that one of the first parts of our bodies when we die is just the brain. So now I think the most convenient and also silly theory. Edgar Allan Poe died from a flu. Edgar Allan Poe died from a flu that worsened to a mortal pneumonia. Because you must know that few days before arriving in Baltimore, Allan Poe went to a doctor complaining not to feel well. He arrived in Baltimore, and in those specific days it was rainy and it was very cold, and this could worsen the flu, taking him to a fatal pneumonia. So they say this theory could explain the high fever, could explain the hallucinations, the visions, the full state of confusion in which Allan Poe was found, and so on. But I think that it doesn't explain the reason why he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him, and it's just a convenient theory because there aren't concrete proofs that he had the flu. Other theories to rule out. Allan Poe suffered from epilepsy and neurosyphilis. I tell you the reason why we must rule out these theories. Because Allan Poe, he was going to marry Sarah Elmira after 10 days before he was murdered. So if he knew to be so severely ill, he had a very good heart, and he was very sensitive. So he would never ask Sarah Elmira to marry him if he knew that he was ill almost to death. So it's to rule out. Then also to rule out the tuberculosis meningitis, because they say his wife Virginia died from tuberculosis. So Edgar Allan Poe could have got the tuberculosis too, but it's not so. He hadn't tuberculosis, and also many people told me from the analysis of his hair, he hadn't tuberculosis. So I go on, and now we are finally at the real cause of the death of one of the greatest dark Gothic romantic and genius in the history of the world. The theory, and it's now a certainty, murder! Edgar Allan Poe was brutally, horrifying, murdered. So, the journalist and historian John Evangelist Walsh published a book in 2000 in which he stated that Edgar Allan Poe was murdered by the three brothers of his fiancée, Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, because she was very rich and she remained widowed, and she had many money, and they were scared that Edgar Allan Poe wanted to marry her money and not Sarah Elmira because he loved him. It's completely false, because Sarah Elmira was the first fiancée of Edgar Allan Poe, and at the time Sarah Elmira gave up on the relationship, on the engagement with Edgar Allan Poe. So they were both widowed and widower, so they could finally marry each other. And also the motive of the three terrible brothers Shelton is not so, because this was the theory by John Evangelist Walsh. As I told you, Edgar Allan Poe was going to marry Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton. But his family, and above all the three terrible Shelton brothers, weren't so happy about this upcoming wedding. And so they enticed Allan Poe in Baltimore, beated him brutally, forcing him to drink whiskey, and leaving him agonizing in a blood pool. However, and fortunately, the historians claim that it's a theory, just an hypothesis. There is not any proof, no concrete proofs, and they didn't agree with this theory at all. And I completely agree with them now that I know who really murdered Edgar Allan Poe. So, at this point, it's necessary to tell you the main facts in the life of Edgar Allan Poe, which will surprise you really, to understand better the reason why he ended up to be murdered, even if he was guiltless, he was completely innocent. So, Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston on January the 19th, 1809. He was the second born from the English actress Elizabeth Arnold and from the American actor David Poe Jr. He had a brother, William, and a sister, Rosalie. But the father abandoned his family in 1810 when Allan Poe was only 1 year old, and his mother died the following year from pulmonary tuberculosis. So Edgar Allan Poe was orphan, and he was adopted by the Allan family. John Allan was a Scottish, rich, successful merchant who lived in Richmond, in Virginia. The Allan were his foster family, because even if they baptize him with the name, baptize him with the name Edgar Allan Poe in church, they never adopted him formally. And his parents wanted him to have a strict English education, so making him study in England, where the maximum writers and English poets had a great influence on Allan Poe. Then in 1820 he came back to his family, the Allan, in Virginia. Then, in this period, he deeply fell in love with Sarah, the woman I was telling you just a few minutes ago. He fell in love truly and deeply with Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton. So they got engaged before he subscribed at the University of Virginia to study modern and ancient languages. During the studies at the university, he lost contact with his fiancée, and he quarreled many times with his father John Allan, because Allan Poe complained that his father didn't send him money to pay the courses at the university, to buy the books and for the accommodation. Instead, John Allan, and I can tell you that he wasn't the father somebody could wish to have, because he also had slaves at that time. He wasn't a good fellow. So he stated it's not the truth. And he said that he was sending him money and dresses, but it wasn't so. And they also quarreled because, according to John Allan, Poe had many gambling debts. Allan Poe abandoned the university after only 1 year, and he returned to Richmond, not feeling comfortable with his family, but above all because he did a very bitter discovery. He discovered that his fiancée, Sarah Elmira, got married with a wealthy man called Alexander. So he decided to move in Boston in the April 1827, supporting himself with occasional jobs as employee and journalist. He started to use the nickname, in that period, he started to use the nickname Henry Le Rennet. Then, because he needed money, This is the period that he dedicated himself to the military career, but not because he was particularly, no, he wasn't so attracted by the military career, but he needed money. And think about the cruelty of John Allan. John Allan didn't make Allan Poe know that his mother, Frances, was severely ill from tuberculosis, and he even didn't warn Edgar Allan Poe when his mother, Frances Allan, died. When Edgar Allan Poe immediately realized this horrible news, he rushed to where they lived, but he wasn't in time for the funeral, so he only saw her gravestone. So, as I told you, John Allan was a very bad, evilish man. And after death of Francis, he got married for the second time. He had some children, and he repudiated Edgar Allan Poe. So Edgar Allan Poe finished the period of the military career with a self-sabotage, and he started to promote his career as writer. But he found himself in a very difficult period for writers, because think about that Edgar Allan Poe was the first writer from the United States who tried to live maintaining himself economically only by pen. Because he found so many difficulties in earning money, because at that time, just in that period, there wasn't an international law for the copyright right. Moreover, the editors often refused to pay their authors, or they paid them very late. Oh my gosh, it was really hard to survive only by pen. So Allan Poe tried to keep on maintaining himself economically with the work of writer, but he often asked money to friends and so on. Then he came back to Baltimore, and he married secretly on September the 22nd, 1835, his cousin Virginia Eliza Clem. And think about that, Poe was 26, while Virginia was only 13. On the certificate of wedding, there was written that Virginia was 21. However, the wedding in that period was chaste. They lived like brother and sister. At least in that period, then we don't know, but I assume that then they of course their relationship wasn't so passionate. It was more a marriage of hearts, sentiments and souls. However, however, when Virginia was 16 and Edgar Allan Poe was working for the newspaper Messenger until the January 1837, on May the 16th, 1836, married Virginia again in Richmond, and it's for sure that from that time they shared the same bed. In this period, in 1838, he wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and one of his most famous book in the terror. In 1839, he published 2 volumes, Tales of the I have also these tales in this maxi compilation of Edgar Allan Poe. These are all my books, poems, novels by Edgar Allan Poe. I have almost all his writing, so I think as I made my studio is because I always loved Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm a dark Gothic romantic and also macabre writer and artist too. So, he published Tales of the Grotesque and the Arabesque. In 1840, he wrote masterpieces as The Fall of the House of Usher, Morella, William Wilson, The Comet, and many others. So, he was the first one, the starter of a new kind of literary style. I'm talking about detective novels, because he wrote The Murders in the Rue Margue. And he also wrote The Mystery of Mary Roget. And now I want to tell you a curiosity, because in the past I investigated by myself this case, but it's really quite impossible to discover the identity of the murderer of Mary Roget, because Mary Roget really existed. Mary Roget, called Mary, and she was famous because she was very, very beautiful. She was a tobacconist. When one day she disappeared and she was found dead in the river Hudson, New York. So it is said that Edgar Allan Poe knew personally this tobacconist, whose name was Mary. So he decided to investigate for a period to discover the identity of his killer, calling Marie Roget Mary, and the setting of the story was in France. Instead, the real Mary Roget was tobacconist in New York. So, now I go on. On January 1842, Virginia, unfortunately, got ill from tuberculosis, and Edgar Allan Poe started to drink heavily, so much alcohol to calm the stress, because he was working very, very hard to cure Virginia. And after so many masterpieces, in 1845 he published The Raven! The Raven! That has become the most famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe. But think about, even if this huge success made him immediately a celebrity, he was paid only $9. Oh my God, such a shame. In 1846, Allan Poe and Virginia moved to Fordham in New York, that worker that nowadays is called the Bronx. Virginia died on January the 30th, 1847, and this was really one of the hardest and cruelest period for Edgar Allan Poe, who went into a deep depression. And think about that, he was extremely poor because he used the sheet of the double kit as shroud for his wife. And also thanks to a friend of Virginia, this friend helped him to pay the funeral and the tomb. Oh my God! Allan Poe was deeply depressed, and his drinking alcohol in that period worsened over and over. Think about that he was found more than once during the winter, at night, in the snow, on the tomb of his beloved wife, Virginia. When he returned to Richmond, he discovered that his first love fiancée, Sarah Elmira, was widowed because Alexander died. So he got engaged with his first love, Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton. And in the April 1849, he stopped drinking and using opium. And he wanted to detoxify completely. And he entered the movement Sons of Temperance. 6 months after, when everything was going to be more better and he was enthusiastic about marrying Sarah Elmira, Edgar Allan Poe was found agonizing near to death the 3rd of October 1849 in Baltimore in severe conditions. He was taken in hospital in the Washington College of Baltimore, where he died on October the 7th, 1849 at 5 a.m. The doctor immediately referred to the police and also to the journalists that before dying, Allan Poe insisting and repeating the surname Reynolds. And think about that all the medical reports and his official certificate of death got lost. So it was for sure a murder and cover-up. Medias at the time wrote these bullshits. He died from delirium tremens, he died because he was an alcoholic, he died because he had an inflammation of brain, and so on. So Allan Poe was a genius, really more genius than what many people know. Think about that. Allan Poe was writer, poet, literary critic, journalist, editor, essayist, and nowadays he would also be called investigator, journalist, the starter of detective novels, and one of the greatest writer, dark Gothic romantic writers, and also in the literature of horror. He wrote many also psychological thrillers, and he even wrote tales of adventures and tales of science fiction. I want to stress that reading, I read almost, I think, all the poems, all the novels, all the tales, all the works by Edgar Allan Poe. And I can tell you that even if he's defined a dark Gothic romantic writer, he also, because of the period of the Romanticism, I think that he could have been defined also a member of decadentism, because in his writings, if you are a fan of Allan Poe or if you read these horror tales, novels, and so on, he wrote carefully and in details those horrifying particulars like death, like the decomposition of the bodies, the burial of the living, of the corpses. He was into the macabre. And you can see also, I've already shown you some photos, and then I will show you other documents in which Allan Poe was in a photo like this. Think about that I bought this skull, of course it's not a true skull, when I was only 13 years old, because I was born dark, Gothic, romantic, and also with a taste for decadentism too. And this passion also to investigate, even in a murder of almost 2 centuries ago. So, and he was also interested in paranormal. In fact, his works are considered very dark. He also experimented writing satire. He was interested in science, in physics of the particles, cosmology, occult, and esotericism. And he even formulated a cosmologic theory that was very similar to the Big Bang theory that was formulated 80 years after his death. So he was completely a genius. And now I want to talk about some curiosities you must know, and then I will reveal you the identity of the man who brutally murdered Allan Poe. You must know that many movies we watch are inspired by novels and tales by Edgar Allan Poe. I suggest you these movies like House of Usher in 1960, a horror movie with the mythical Vincent Price and The Tomb of Ligeia of 1964 with always Vincent Price and Elizabeth Shepherd. The Mask of the Red Death of 1964 with Vincent Price and Hazel Colt. These were all horror movies. I suggest you a very great movie, The Pit and the Pendulum of 1961, always with Vincent Price. Then, Tales of Terror of 1962, a horror movie, always with Vincent Price. Think about The Raven. When I say the title The Raven, you immediately think about the movie of 2012 with John Cusack, Luke Evans, and so on. No, the first Raven was shot in 1963. There was always Vincent Price and also Jack Nicholson. Then, The Black Cat, an Italian movie I really suggest you, of 1981 by one of my favorite directors ever, Lucio Fulci. Then, Two Evil Eyes in 1990. There are two episodes. The former by the mythical George Romero, and the latter, The Black Cat, by the genius Dario Argento. Now, let's talk briefly about The Raven, of a movie of 2012, director James McTaggart, with a very great John Cusack playing the part of Edgar Allan Poe, and also a very great Luke Evans playing the role of Detective Phils. First of all, you must know that that story, even if the movie is very good, is completely invented. In this movie, there is a serial killer who kidnaps and then kills beautiful women, beautiful young women. It didn't exist, but this movie was basic to put the attention to the surname Reynolds, because you must know that even in the movie there is the killer. Now I'm making spoiler, so if you don't want to know who the killer is, don't listen to me for 4 minutes. In the movie, the killer of Edgar Allan Poe is Ivan Reynolds. Ivan Reynolds didn't exist at all. The only truth in this movie is that the murderer of the real Edgar Allan Poe and his real murderer, his surname was Reynolds. Nothing else true. So it was important, this movie, to put more attention about this Reynolds. Who was the real Reynolds who murdered Edgar Allan Poe? I'm going to unveil you the truth right now. So, James Harrison, who published a letter written to Maria Clem, stated that Reynolds could have been the author of the address on the subject of a surveying and exploring expedition to the Pacific Ocean and the South Seas, which could have inspired Poe to write his novel The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. This address, presented in the Southern Literary Messenger, January 1837, by Jeremiah and Reynolds was a proposal for exploring the Pacific and South Seas for the benefit of the whale fishing expansion. Under the header of this article is the note, Critical Notes by Edgar Allan Poe, editor. Edgar Allan Poe worked for the Southern Literary Messenger. These two coincide, and this brings light to the idea that this Jeremiah Reynolds, whose article Poe edited, could have been the Reynolds whom Poe repeated on his deathbed more times before dying. Jeremiah Reynolds, Arthur Robson Quinn, who wrote the biography of Edgar Allan Poe, titled Edgar Allan Poe, A Critical Biography, agrees with the theory that Reynolds was Jeremiah and Reynolds, because Poe wrote Arthur Gordon Pym, and from that to Jeremiah and Reynolds, projector of the voyages to the South Seas, whose very language he had used in that tale. So he could have easily known Reynolds. But there is also a Jeremiah and Reynolds who appears in a bankruptcy petition written by Poe from 1842. This Reynolds, most likely, is the same Reynolds noted above, had given $10 to Poe, and Poe owed him money. But Jeremiah and Reynolds is not the killer of Edgar Allan Poe. Are you ready? Now you will discover the identity, name and surname of the murderer of Edgar Allan Poe after almost 2 centuries. Henry R. Reynolds, who was a carpenter in Baltimore, serving at the 4th Ward polls as election judge. Henry Reynolds. This is the couping theory. Exactly. The couping theory was the lead to follow. But at that time, then, they had been mistaken these leads. So, these theories involved ambassadors for political figures going about town and snatching victims who they would strip off and replace their own clothes, send them to polls, and force them to stuff ballots. Henry Reynolds was involved in the political campaigns. At the same time, these events regarding Allan Poe happened. John Evangelist Walsh stated in the Midnight Diary these words, as newspapers of the day record, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls in Gunners Hall on election day, one of the 3 presiding judges was a man who bore the name of Henry Reynolds, Henry R. Reynolds. Present in the same room as Poe on October the 3rd at Ryan's place, only days before he began in his delirium to call out the name, was an actual flesh and blood Reynolds. But then he also stated that there are inconsistencies with his theory, and he even discounted the facts because I tell you, I'm pretty sure at that time he was threatened, okay? But we must rule out definitely Jeremiah Reynolds because he was living with his family in New York, and in those days when Allan Poe was in Baltimore, Jeremiah Reynolds was with his family in New York and not in Baltimore, Maryland. So we got to know that Mr. Henry R. Reynolds and his family lived in the neighborhood of the hospital of Baltimore in which Allan Poe died. On September the 27th, Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond to Philadelphia with the purpose to go to his cottage in the Bronx, New York. On October the 3rd, a printer whose name was Joseph Walker recognized Poe in a delirious state outside of the Tavern Gunner's Hall in Baltimore. The tavern, also known as Ryan's Tavern, was at the time host to vote collectors from 1849 election, and so we return to the theory of cooping, and the only Reynolds in the crime scene was the Judge Henry R. Reynolds. When Walker asked Allan Poe if there was anybody he could contact for him, Allan Poe answered Joseph Snodgrass, who was an editor he knew and he trusted in him. He was taken to Washington College Hospital of Baltimore. Poe was settled alone in a windowless room with only one person, Dr. John Moran, who repeated until the end, Reynolds, 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 and then he died when he was only 40. The theory of cooping is the solution. Because Allan Poe was forced to drink, wearing not his clothes, physically assaulted, and he was just outside the tavern, turned into a polling place. And there was, who was there? Henry R. Reynolds. So the murderer of Edgar Allan Poe was Judge Henry R. Reynolds, of course, for the cooping and for the politicians' elections. And remember that when a person who is close to die screams out a name, or is the name of the loved one, or is the name of his own murderer, as in this case. Henry R. Reynolds murdered Edgar Allan Poe. And now I will show you all the shocking videos, documents and photos. And now I start with videos. I start with the cold, softer ones until the stronger ones, because there are images that could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers. I start.
Out of writing if he hadn't been the main character in this dark novella. Nobody knows just what happened to Edgar Allan Poe in the week prior when he left Richmond, Virginia to head home to New York, but what we do know is that on October the 3rd, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe was found delirious in a tavern in Baltimore. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe was in such a state that Joseph W. Walker, a local printer and someone who Poe had no connection with, was moved enough to send a letter to Poe's friend, Joseph E. Snodgrass, asking for help. The letter read, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather the worse for wear at Ryan's 4th Ward Polls who goes under the cognomen of Edgar Allan Poe and who appears in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you he is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Walker." Snodgrass hurried to Edgar Allan Poe's aid, and when he reached him was horrified at what he saw. Snodgrass said that Poe was repulsive to look at. His appearance was one of complete and utter mess, from his unkempt hair, his unwashed face and clothes that were tattered and ill-fitting. Edgar Allan Poe was almost unrecognisable compared to the well-kept, sophisticated man around town he had previously been. Snodgrass also stated that Edgar Allan Poe was in a state of beastly intoxication. Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital, where he was confined to a room with bars on the window, admitting no contact with the outside world, and attended to by his doctor, Joseph Moran. He would spend the next 4 days fading in and out of lucidity before passing on October the 7th, 1849. So what happened? What horror befell the master of the macabre? Edgar Allan Poe was a victim of a practice known as couping, wherein a person is forced to vote multiple times to help rig an election and force-fed liquor to make them compliant. Poe biographer J.H. Ingram received a letter from William Hand Brown in which Brown stated, "The general belief here is that Poe was seized by one of these gangs, cooped, stupefied with liquor, dragged out and voted, and then turned adrift to die." Elsewhere, author John Evangelist Walsh claimed in his book Midnight Dreary, released in 2000, that Edgar Allan Poe was murdered by the brothers of his fiancée Sarah Shelton. The Sheltons were incredibly wealthy, and Sarah Shelton's 3 brothers had no intention of allowing a lowly writer and editor like Edgar Allan Poe to marry into their money.
Life story of Edgar Allan Poe. In 1809, a boy named Edgar Poe was born to 2 traveling stage actors. Edgar's father was David Poe Jr., who hailed from a military family so hardcore that David had to refer to his dad as General. Needless to say, those folks weren't exactly happy when Jr. fell in love with the talented thespian Eliza Arnold, nor when he followed her onto stage himself. After marrying, the couple had 2 sons, William and Edgar. The latter boy was named after a character in Shakespeare's King Lear, which the couple was performing at the time. Sadly, David wasn't a very good father. His struggles with heavy drinking, fighting, and financial hardship were stressful enough for the family, but he also resented Eliza's far more successful acting career. Eventually, he deserted his family, leaving Eliza alone to raise the children. Worse still, when young Edgar was just 3 years old, Eliza came down sick and died. Apparently, David died soon afterward, though the circumstances of his demise are hitherto unknown. Regardless, this left the young children with no parents and no safe place to go. As Poe grew older, when Allan repeatedly refused to lend Poe money, leading to his gradual descent into destitution. For his part, Allan seems to have been remarkably dismissive of the boy's concerns. He once wrote Poe off as quite miserable, sulky, and ill-tempered, for example. He also liked to boast about his own generosity in paying for Poe's education, while refusing to actually pay for it at the same time. Not the kind of guy you'd want as a dad, that's for sure.
That was John Allan.
Starving and receiving basically nothing from his so-called father, he turned to a truly last-ditch solution.
The adoptive father. And now Edgar Allan Poe is the period in which he does the period of the military career until he does everything to be fired, and he succeeded in it.
Royster was Poe's first and final love. Unfortunately, the two never married, and their relationship hit more than a few snags along the way. Sarah and Edgar were childhood friends and neighbors, and became engaged as teenagers. When Poe left to attend the University of Virginia, the two star-crossed lovers went long distance, but everything came crashing down when Royster's father caught wind. He simply didn't want an orphan like Poe as a son-in-law, so he intercepted their letters and left both kids thinking the other was ignoring them. When Poe returned home, he found that she had married a wealthier man in his place. Based on this sad tale, many have speculated that Sarah may have been the long-lost Lenore mentioned in The Raven.
Shall I ever hold again that
This was the mythical Vincent Price, who acted almost in all the movies, all the movies inspired from the novels of Edgar Allan Poe. And now I go.
His husband died in 1848. Poe reached out to her again and they rekindled their romance. His initial proposal was rebuffed, but a few months later she accepted. Those wedding bells never rang out, however, because Poe died just 10 days before the wedding. Despite Poe's magnificent talent and fierce desire for success, he spent most of his life in poverty, and his work was consistently undervalued. His first poetry collection, Tamerlane, was a financial disaster, which probably wasn't helped by his unwise decision to use the obvious pseudonym A. Bostonian. His second book, the imaginatively titled Poems, only got off the ground when Poe convinced his fellow army cadets to lend him money to get it running. Even when he was shopping for a publisher for his landmark poem, The Raven, one magazine not only rejected it, but actually gave Poe $15 in sympathy cash. When he finally sold the poem to the American Review, it netted him just $9. Fortunately, The Raven garnered Poe enough mainstream attention to eke out a living as a professional writer. In fact, he became something of a household name, gave lectures, and even ran his own magazine. But his personal life was a mess at the time. His wife Virginia was ill, and his finances weren't particularly sturdy. Even at the peak of his career, his annual salary totaled just $624, around 20 grand in today's money. As Poe struggled through his life, he increasingly began to rely on alcohol to support him. This problem only worsened during social situations, which often required Poe to keep up a good mood and therefore caused him no small amount of stress. The death of Poe's wife, Virginia, in 1847 didn't exactly help things either. While it's impossible to properly diagnose someone who lived over 100 years ago, it does seem likely that Poe was an alcoholic. But that's not really the whole story. The reality of Poe's very genuine suffering is often clouded by the false stories told by those who disliked him. His enemies often tried to paint him as a town drunk and a drug addict, neither of which was true. As far as drugs go, Poe only seems to have occasionally used opium for medical purposes, which was fairly common at the time. He certainly wasn't the inebriated ne'er-do-well that some people considered him either. In fact, we don't have much real evidence that he deserved the reputation he was given, which makes it so unfortunate that it lasts even to this day. Edgar Allan Poe was just 40 years old when he passed away, to find his luggage. He was later found sprawled in a gutter wearing someone else's clothes, unable to move, and screaming out for someone named Reynolds. He died 4 days later. So what happened? Well, many at the time were quick to blame alcohol, but his attending physician disputed this notion. Various diseases have been suggested too, such as tuberculosis and brain lesions. But one of the most prevalent theories comes down to the fact that he was found outside a voting booth. The idea goes that Poe was the victim of cooping, a horrifying voter fraud scam at the time. Cooping occurred when corrupt politicians paid criminals to drug innocent bystanders, particularly homeless, and then forced them to vote at location after location, until some of them finally dropped dead. Treatment of Edgar Allan Poe didn't let up after his death. His funeral was hastily conducted only a day after he died, resulting in just 7 people attending, one of whom had nothing but harsh words to say about him. But we'll come on to that mess in just a minute. Initially buried in an unmarked grave, it took 11 years for Poe's cousin to purchase a real monument for him. Before the monument could be mounted, however, it was destroyed when a speeding train came off its rails and crashed directly into the stonecarver's place of business. Which,
my God! Have you watched? I'm really shocked.
The funds to give Poe the monument he deserved. Except that wasn't the end, because his coffin then accidentally shattered to pieces during the transfer.
Oh my God!
Not so holy man wrote the obituary under the pen name Ludwig, and he used it as a chance to portray Poe as being the drunken, drug-addicted, unsavory character that many still see him as today. As you might imagine, Griswold had a personal reason for besmirching Poe's legacy. Over the years, the two men had gone back and forth between being friends, enemies, and literary rivals, and Poe's public critiques of Griswold's work did not go forgotten. Now, these days, writers are generally advised to not get too antsy about bad reviews and criticism, but Griswold was such a bitter little man that he followed up his nasty, deceptive obituary with an equally nasty, deceptive book about Poe's entire life. Ironically, Griswold's portrait of Poe as a dark, disturbed figure ended up making his old enemy even more famous, while Griswold himself has become a mere footnote in literary history. Kinda feels like karma, don't you think?
I
Edgar
believe
Allan
in
Poe never
karma
received-
too. He made everything to destroy the image of Edgar Allan Poe, and instead he made it more famous. Now, are you ready? Because now I'm going to show you extremely rare videos, shocking photos and documents. I warn you, some images could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers. These videos and photos, documents are extremely rare and curiosities you don't find easily. This was the picture of the hospital in which Edgar Allan Poe died in 1849. Now you see how it is nowadays.
At the age of 40, America's most infamous storyteller would pass on to the annals of history, leaving behind a literary legacy that would be admired for generations.
And yet, the myths surrounding his death have become inexplicably intertwined with how the man supposedly lived his life.
This was the real Allan Poe.
Conspiracies,
I want you
plots of intrigue
to
and
see his photos
Admired for
better. Because here, this was a newspaper of 1849. So I think that nowadays I'm shooting this documentary. We are on July 2024, and I think that we are not so evolved after almost 2 centuries. This was Edgar Allan Poe. Then I will make you see his wonderful light blue eyes.
The myths surrounding his death have become inexplicably intertwined with how the man supposedly lived his life. Curious tales, conspiracies, plots of intrigue, and speculations that grow more fantastical with every rendition. And at the core of it all, the only known fact: Edgar had arrived in Baltimore on September 27th. His whereabouts between that day and October 3rd may hold the key to unlocking the mystery of how the father of the detective story met his end. His obituary, ironically penned by the author's arch nemesis, paints a disturbing picture, one that is universally considered today's image of Poe. A shambling drunk reprobate who spurned his narrative detractors, addicted to opium and wandering the shadowed corners of depression and despair.
He was at all times a dreamer, dwelling in ideal realms in heaven or hell, peopled with creatures and the accidents of his brain. He walked the streets in madness or melancholy, with lips moving in indistinct curses.
It was really this enemy was disrespectful also in death. Such a shame, Griswold. Now you are nothing, and Allan Poe will live for eternity. And now, shocking documents, okay? I go immediately. I am here. Be prepared.
The year of 1847 would see the world of Edgar Allan Poe finally crack. On January 30th, after suffering from tuberculosis, Poe's beloved wife died.
Virginia's death completely devastated him.
The swift flicker of his young wife's short life would seem to haunt Edgar for eternity.
The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?
Look, watch at this. This was the first wife died from tuberculosis. She was Virginia Eliza. Look at the picture. She was incredibly beautiful. Really, really amazing, beautiful, and so terrible loss for Edgar Allan Poe, for sure.
Summoning the strength to somehow carry on without his beloved Virginia, Poe decided to establish his own literary magazine called The Stylus. For nearly 2 years, Poe would seek out investors and court prospective contributors to this quest to bring his scholarly dreams to life. Finally, luck would strike twofold in 1849, when he returned to Richmond, as by this time he had acquired not only enough money to start funding The Stylus, but he had also become engaged to childhood sweetheart Sarah Elmira Royster Shilton.
He wanted to put his best foot forward, and he was a widower and wanted to start a new life with her and to...
In fact, also Sarah, his first fiancée, was widowed too, so they could finally get married after all this time, because she was, as I explained you, his first fiancée. And now, think about that he was brutally murdered 10 days before his wedding. Oh my God! It's also an incredible coincidence with Brandon Lee, who died 17 days before getting married. But it's a pure coincidence because, as I explained to you, Brandon Lee has been murdered, and also Edgar Allan Poe has been murdered, and I'm sure, and then I will show you even in these videos, the man who murdered him. Now, okay, other shock. I told you that the real hair of Edgar Allan Poe have been analyzed. Think about in 1999, and now I immediately show you his true hair in 1999. Oh my gosh! It's really incredible. I immediately make you show you.
Tests of Poe's hair in 1999 have ruled out the possibility of any potential toxic interventions, which may have explained the poet's sickly state. The case of Poe's death by
even the analysis of his trailer in 1999. Oh my God, at the end of the 90s, confirmed that he didn't die from intoxications from... This was the solution of his murder.
Baltimore in the 1840s was known as a mob town, a haven for political corruption and civil discord. Dishonest politicians would enlist the aid of any number of the city's most notorious gangs to help sway elections in their favor. Gangs known as the Rip Raps, the Blood Tubs, and the Plug Uglies would routinely do muscle work for the Whig or Democratic politicians who paid them. These gangs would resort to any number of practices such as ballot stuffing, intimidation, bribery, and even kidnapping. It is believed that during this election time, Poe was a victim of a practice known as cooping.
They would go off into the street and grab someone vulnerable, drag them into a room, coop them there, feed them alcohol and opium until it was time to vote.
Would get you drunk and take you around to different polling places and have you vote multiple times.
Maybe shave them, cut their hair, change their clothes in some way, take them back in so that the ballot judge would kind of look the other way.
Cooping was a unique weapon of political terror, but one that was widely known. The day that Poe was found, a local Baltimore newspaper warned of the practice.
October 3rd. Beware of the Whig tricks. Our opponents are at their old game again. Illegal votes will be polled from a distance and otherwise. Coups have been started by them. All this and more the Whigs are doing. See, Democrats, that they do not succeed. Let us all be on alert.
Edgar Allan Poe was found in a tavern that was also serving as a polling place. He was found on election day, not in his own clothing.
Well, the fact that he was found at a polling place, that he was wearing clothes that...
Exactly. And here we are at my theory and also certainty. And now the identity I already told you, but I want these experts to explain you. No doubts, he was the killer of Edgar Allan Poe.
All the history really confirms is that he was found in Gunner's Tavern, and the accounts say that he was unconscious at the time.
Leading up to his final hours, in a state of delirium, Poe was heard to be calling the name Reynolds. This added to the mystery until it was discovered that a Judge Henry R. Reynolds had been overseeing the voting in Ryan's Tavern.
This lends credibility to the theory that Poe was indeed inside the polling area at some point. Now, combining with the sickness that seemed to pervade him before he departed for Baltimore, it seems that the Dark Poet was a victim of political scheming.
Exactly! He was a victim of the couping, and the murderer, the identity of the killer of Edgar Allan Poe was Judge Henry R. Reynolds, that's for sure. And now be prepared, because this is a very strong photo. I'm going to show you the photo of Edgar Allan Poe, dead into the coffin. So I warn you, because this image could disturb the sensitivity of the viewers. It's really, really rare, but it's so. Here we are. This was Edgar Allan Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, into the coffin. This was the real Edgar Allan Poe lying into the coffin. And it's I think it's a strong image, and also I think so extremely rare. Rest in peace, Edgar Allan Poe. Now everybody must know that you was brutally murdered. Otherwise, you are going to marry your long-lasting love, Sarah Elmira. This is an injustice. He was only 40. And finally, I make you see the tomb where Edgar Allan Poe actually is buried, and also the previous ones. So I go because it's very interesting, and a place where all the fans of Edgar Allan Poe go.
Edgar Allan Poe passed away under horrific conditions. He was buried here in 1849 and would be reinterred to a more prominent section of this small cemetery in 1875, with a large amount of spectators here to witness that. This site, this location, and these grounds are considered some of the most historic in all of Baltimore, and we are here, right in the middle of all of it, to explore this amazing place and take a look at the life and tragic death of Edgar Allan Poe.
So, and now, I show you this, and I know that you can appreciate it. I make you immediately see this. This was the first gravestone of Edgar Allan Poe, and it's incredible because you always see the raven. Original burial place. It's really incredible to see his gravestone, and I want to tell you this because I know that Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, was the most successful poem and work, and Darkness and this poem said, darkness there and nothing more, deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. Let my heart be still a moment and this mystery explore. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. I just read you some passages from the masterpiece long poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. So, nevermore silence about the brutal and cruel murder of Edgar Allan Poe. Nevermore.